While Donald Trump was busy issuing sweeping ultimatums and threatening the Canadian government with comprehensive across the board tariffs, a development occurred that took the entirety of the Washington political establishment by surprise. In a move that defied traditional geopolitical playbooks, Canada did not respond by imposing its own retaliatory tariffs on American goods, nor did they move to ban critical exports or issue the kind of dramatic, televised threats that have become common in modern trade disputes. Instead, the leadership in Ottawa opted for a strategy that proved far more devastating to the American industrial complex. They quietly and systematically withdrew from the voluntary supply chain coordination agreements that have served as the invisible backbone of North American manufacturing for over 70 years. Within a matter of hours, the repercussions of this strategic withdrawal began cascading through the American industrial system in ways that no amount of political spin or media damage control could effectively conceal. This was not a standard trade dispute that could be smoothed over with a clever tweet or a hastily organized press conference. Rather, it represented a high-stakes collision between political recklessness and the unyielding reality of global economics. The speed of the fallout was far greater than anyone within the administration had predicted, catching policymakers off guard as the gears of American industry began to grind to a halt. In the industrial heartlands of Michigan and Ohio, automotive assembly plants began receiving urgent notices that shipments of critical components originating from Canada were being delayed indefinitely. It is important to note that these shipments were not cancelled or banned by the Canadian government, as such a move would have triggered specific legal mechanisms. Instead, they were simply delayed, trapped in a logistical limbo that effectively destroyed production schedules. In the modern era of manufacturing, where the entire model is built upon just-in-time delivery systems with zero inventory buffers, a delay of even 3 days is functionally identical to a complete factory shutdown. You cannot complete a vehicle without every single part, and when those parts are idling at a border crossing, 20,000 workers are forced to stand idle while their paychecks and the economic stability of their communities begin to evaporate. The crisis quickly spread beyond the automotive sector. Construction firms across the United States suddenly discovered that essential shipments of Canadian steel and lumber were not clearing customs according to the tight timelines their contracts were built around. Projects valued at billions of dollars were suddenly facing massive delays, triggering expensive penalty clauses, causing cost overruns, and creating cascading failures across entire development portfolios. Simultaneously, the energy markets reacted with immediate panic, as traders realized that the guaranteed minimum flows of Canadian oil and natural gas, which the U.S. has relied upon for decades, were no longer guaranteed. Uncertainty flooded the market. This volatility wasn't necessarily born from a physical shortage of supply, but from the sudden disappearance of the assumption of reliability. Prices spiked overnight because the pricing models that govern American energy depend on stability above all else. What triggered this unprecedented crisis was not a simple misunderstanding or a technical disagreement over trade quotas. It was an ultimatum. The Trump administration had presented Canada with what they characterized as a final demand. Canada must agree to restrict its own exports of critical materials unless American companies were granted preferential access at prices significantly below the global market rate. When you strip away the political rhetoric, the meaning was clear. The United States government was demanding that a sovereign nation sell its natural resources at a financial loss simply to satisfy a political narrative in Washington. This wasn't about addressing genuine resource shortages or stabilizing markets during a national emergency. It was an attempt to force Canada to subsidize American industries by surrendering the economic value that rightfully belonged to Canadian workers and shareholders. When Canadian officials examined the specifics of this demand, they understood immediately that compliance was not merely economically damaging, it was existential. To agree to such terms would have established a dangerous precedent, signaling that Canadian sovereignty could be overridden whenever an American president decided that applying pressure was politically convenient. This was the line that Ottawa refused to cross. And the moment they stood their ground, the inherent fragility of the entire American production system became impossible to hide. This is where the administration's fundamental misunderstanding of modern economics became painfully evident. In a deeply integrated and specialized supply chain, size does not automatically equate to leverage. While the United States has a much larger GDP, Canada sits at strategic choke points involving energy, minerals, automotive components, and construction materials. These are not products that American industries can simply source elsewhere on short notice. Replacing these supply lines would require years of time and massive capital investments that the private sector is currently unprepared to make. The administration issued its ultimatum as if Canada had no choice but to fold, assuming that the asymmetry of economic size guaranteed submission. However, that assumption ignored the basic reality of modern manufacturing. It is a fragile, synchronized choreography where the absence of a single component can idle an entire facility. As the disruption moved through the American economy, an unusual shift occurred in corporate boardrooms. Executives who had remained silent during previous trade skirmishes began making frantic late-night calls to Congress and the White House. They weren't calling to debate ideology or political strategy. They were calling to explain cold operational facts. They warned that factories would shut down within days, tens of thousands of workers would be furloughed, and competitors in Europe and Asia who were not dealing with this self-inflicted chaos would permanently capture market share that American companies would never be able to recover. These were not hypothetical warnings. They were backed by hard data, inventory counts, and contractual obligations that could no longer be met. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce and various manufacturing associations began releasing emergency statements and projections showing hundreds of thousands of jobs at immediate risk. Industry coalitions that typically avoid public political confrontation began demanding that the administration reverse its course before irreversible damage occurred. The consequences of treating trade policy as performance art became impossible to ignore. When a factory stops, there is no narrative that can fix it. When a worker is sent home without pay, there is no slogan that can cover their mortgage. And when energy prices spike, every American consumer feels it immediately in their heating bills and at the gas pump. This moment is particularly dangerous because it follows a predictable pattern of threats issued without viable exit strategies. We have seen this before with tariffs on China that resulted in American farmers needing massive government bailouts, or border threats against Mexico that nearly broke automotive supply lines. But Canada is different. The level of economic integration is deeper, the reliance is more absolute, and the political will to resist in Ottawa is ironclad. This combination creates a crisis that cannot be managed with bluster or last-minute deal-making. As the real economic harm began to materialize, Trump's own political coalition started to fracture. Republican senators from states heavily reliant on Canadian trade demanded a resolution. Labor unions warned of mass layoffs. Business leaders who had once supported the administration began to distance themselves, not out of newfound principle, but because their balance sheets were bleeding. This is the point where the spectacle of strength finally collides with the substance of governance. Dominance that results in domestic economic collapse isn't strength, it is a failure of leadership. The deeper problem, which will outlast this immediate crisis, is the message Canada's response sent to the rest of the world. Allies now see that economic integration with the United States carries a political risk that cannot be managed through normal diplomacy. Once this lesson is learned, it doesn't unlearn itself. Companies are already beginning to adjust their supply chains to reduce exposure to Washington's volatility, and governments are diversifying their trade relationships toward jurisdictions where policy predictability still exists. The world is quietly beginning to build economic systems that do not depend on American reliability, because reliability is the true currency of power, and it is currently being squandered. We are witnessing the exposure of a structural vulnerability that was always present but never tested at this scale. The vulnerability of an economy that assumed cooperation would always exist, even while electing leaders who treated that cooperation with contempt. The consequences of this contradiction are arriving faster than anyone planned, reshaping alliances and strategic calculations across the continent. Once trust is replaced with contingency planning, the old integrated system never truly returns to what it once was. The administration is now trapped. If they double down, the damage to the supply chain accelerates, factories close, and the temporary tactic narrative collapses under the weight of lived experience. If they retreat, the strongman image is shattered, as critics and supporters alike see that the posture of absolute power failed when confronted by a neighbor willing to protect its independence. This crisis has moved into the realm of institutional credibility. Allies are watching to see if the U.S. can sustain partnerships without weaponizing them. Inside Washington, the cracks are widening. Trade experts who warned of this are being proven right, and lawmakers are scrambling to distance themselves from a policy they now have to explain to unemployed constituents. The constitutional imbalance that allows a single executive to cause this much disruption is being scrutinized more intensely than ever. Canada has forced the crisis into the real economy, where trucks, energy flows, and assembly lines don't care about political messaging. The most lasting effect will be the quiet redesign of global supply chains, American companies are now building redundancy and seeking alternative suppliers at higher costs just to avoid political volatility. Once these corporate shifts happen, they are rarely reversed. Canada is not waiting for Washington to fix itself. Ottawa is already deepening ties with Europe and Asia to ensure that no future American ultimatum can threaten its security again. The lesson learned by all American allies is brutally practical. Dependence on a partner who uses interdependence as a weapon is a vulnerability that must be reduced. The tragedy is that none of this was inevitable. The system didn't break because of a disaster, but because political theater was prioritized over stewardship. The people paying the price are not the architects of the policy, but the workers, small business owners, and families facing an uncertain future. This disconnect between those making the decisions and those bearing the costs is corrosive to democracy. The real question now is whether American leadership can relearn the discipline required to manage power in a world where leverage cuts both ways. Strength without restraint is merely self-sabotage. And as Canada has proven, even the largest economies cannot bully their way through the very systems they helped create.